Hi, this is Jennifer Cohn, and I'm here today with the former governor of Alabama, Don Siegelman, and we are going to discuss the topic of election theft as we barrel toward the November 2020 election. This is an issue that Don has some knowledge of, and thank you, Don, for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say I have some personal anecdotes and also some personal experience with election theft. Um, so,
So yeah, if you could tell us.
thank you for engaging in this discussion. I think it's particularly important now that Karl Rove has gone to work for Donald Trump.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You have so much perspective that you can offer on this. So thank you very much. So maybe you can explain to us your background briefly and why it is that you personally have knowledge of election theft involving Karl Rove.
Okay, well, I will try to tell you briefly who I
know
am.
it's a long history.
Yeah, I just finished my book, Stealing Our Democracy, and it is, of course, it's not only about the stealing of my election, but it's also all of the other aspects of the abuse of power, from abuse of power by police, prosecutors, and the President of the United States. But I'd go into my history and take the reader through, how I developed into who I am and how I became, how I decided to enter public service, how I was elected Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, and Governor, and how and why I was targeted and my election stolen in 2002. So briefly, that is me, and I'll be glad to delve into that further if you wish.
Yes, I would like in particular to start discussing the what happened with your own election. So this was in 2002, and was you were running for re-election? Is that right?
I was running for re-election so I could enter the 2004 primaries against George W. Bush. I had just had it with his war policies, education policy, and economic policy, and I felt like a Southern voice, a voice of a Southern progressive governor, particularly from Alabama, would resonate, and I wanted to challenge him. I didn't know whether I'd end up on the ticket, but I thought I had a pretty good shot at being put on there as a VP candidate.
Right. And were you considered a popular politician in Alabama at that time?
Yes, I had been elected to the state's top four offices. Had been in office for over almost 25 years, and I had brought in 5 automobile plants into Alabama, a couple of aerospace companies, and things were moving along fairly well. We had built over 1,000 new schools, and I put a lot of people to work. So I was popular in Alabama, and the Business Journal, the Kiplinger letter, touted me as a possible dark horse candidate who, in the framework of Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, could break the Republicans' stronghold on the South. And I felt like I was in a pretty good position to do that because I had friends scattered out all over the country after having been in office for some 25 years, and also having attended every Democratic National Convention since 1972.
Right. And then just to emphasize, you're the only politician in Alabama who has won the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor. Is that right?
Yes. And at the time, I was
anyway.
the longest running elected Democrat in the Southeast.
Right. And so who was your opponent it was 2002, right? When all this went down, when things went south, so to speak. Who was your political opponent? And what was his connection to Karl Rove? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, my opponent was a lackluster Republican congressman who his biggest claim to fame was that he was absent more than anybody else other than a member of Congress who had been convicted of cocaine. He, I wasn't concerned about him. He had been recruited by Jack Abramoff,
Oh my.
a close friend of Karl Rove's, and the election was moving along, and until the state attorney general, who was Karl Rove's client, began an investigation of me, and
this is in the middle of the campaign.
this was, well, it was during the campaign, yes.
And oh, just briefly, in case people don't know who Jack Abramoff is, he's sort of the most infamous lobbyist probably ever in the United States. He ended up being convicted and serving time for bribery, and I think it was for bribery, but certainly for very shady, it was definitely bribery. And I think even fraud later on, having to do with some sort of casino.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Capital Punishment, and he explained in the book that he had funneled $20 million of Indian casino money into Alabama to defeat me and to defeat a ballot initiative that I had proposed to send all kids to college for free and to create early learning opportunities for every child in Alabama.
And right, and the great, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it was so it was Abramoff, who was Karl Rove's one of Karl Rove's three close college Republican buddies.
Yes.
The other two were Ralph Reed and a guy named Grover Norquist. They're both notorious political figures. And I can tell you this: you're going to read about Ralph Reed being involved in Donald Trump's campaign in 2020 as well.
Oh, dear God. All right.
That Ralph Reed created this bogus organization called the Christian Coalitions of America, American Christian Coalition. And
he's one of these sort of religious right.
Exactly. And so they're going to be trying to fire up the evangelicals behind Donald Trump.
And they make fun of the evangelicals behind their back, right?
They call them wackos behind their back, and then
complete hypocrites, right? They opposed your proposal to use legalized gaming to fund college education and pretended like it was this big moral crusade, when in fact all it was is that they didn't want competition for the Indian casinos that they were representing and getting millions of dollars from.
They were representing the Indian casinos, and they did not.
And they didn't tell the religious right that.
They didn't want a lottery to fund education, and that's what still bothers me today, that they, out of their greed for money and power, that they would penalize the children of the state of Alabama. But I can forgive them for what they did to me, but not for what they did to the children of Alabama.
So, all right. So you had this whole sort of cabal organizing against you and beginning to sort of investigate you even. But you were pushing forward, and were you expected to win that election, by the way, or do you know?
Well, yes. I mean, I was the incumbent. Mm-hmm. I was
popular incumbent.
I brought in Honda, Toyota, Mercedes, Hyundai, and the second Honda plant. We had expanded Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and we were blowing and going and creating a lot of things. We knew because George W. Bush and Karl Rove were in Alabama campaigning against me. Bush made 2 trips to Alabama, one to raise money, which I think was a lot of it was funneled through the Jack Abramoff $20 million. But anyway, regardless, George Bush came into Alabama twice for my opponent. And it was after 9/11. It was at a time when Bush's popularity had bounced up from the high 30s into the low 90s in Alabama.
Oh, wow. Right.
But we still expected to win. I was projected to win, and I did win the night of the election.
So let's actually break down that election night, though. I want to do it kind of slowly because to me, this is one of the most obviously suspect election outcomes that I've read about, and just the sort of breakdown. So it's election night, and there were 3 sets of returns that were posted for your results. And in one of the largest Republican counties, is this right? Was the decisive county Baldwin County?
It is a solid Republican county. And by that, what I mean is the election officials, the sheriff, the probate judge, and circuit clerk, those who control who works at the polling places, and who organize getting ballots out to precincts. They're the ones who determine the number of machines at each voting box. So they have the power to suppress turnout in African American areas, high Democratic turnout areas. And they have the power to create mischief with elections if they want to. Now, you said it was highly suspicious. In my judgment, it's not suspicious. It is absolutely a fact that they stole the election. And here's my
and it's
argument.
very refreshing to hear you say that, actually, because so many candidates, when their outcomes suffer suspicious losses, won't talk about it, or like John Kerry, they wait 15 years before they mention it, even say that they were suspicious. So go ahead, but I really want to talk about election night, how that went down. So like, the time and where you were and where the results were posted and all that stuff.
So I was at my campaign celebration, getting ready. We were waiting for the last county to report, and it's interesting that it was the last county to report that night, and it was keep in mind it's a paper ballot optical scan system,
right?
And so there's no reason for it to be a late county to report, because it's all optical scan. Should have been one of the first counties, but it was the last county. And I'm going to come back and make a point about that a little later.
Yeah.
So the first set of returns that came in were from Baldwin County were just crazy, because they had given the libertarian candidate, who no one had ever heard of, something like twice as many votes as that I got. So when that was brought to the attention of the probate judge, he said, "Yeah, there must be an election glitch, something wrong with the." So they went back in and produced a second set of totals. But this time, when it was around 11 o'clock at night, and they posted the election returns on the door of the courthouse. I think it was the sheriff's office. And they sent all the poll workers and members of the media home.
And what did that second set show?
The second set showed me with enough. I think I was leading by enough. Well, anyway, it gave me enough votes to win statewide, but not of course in that Republican county. But I was never expecting to win a Republican county, but I just needed to win enough votes to win the election.
So it was outcome dispositive. It gave you the election.
So the election was called by AP, by CNN, CBS, all the major networks, and we celebrated. I went home and I was awakened about 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, and they told everyone to leave, right? Is that right? Whoever was at the courthouse where the results are posted, they told everyone to go home and locked up. Is that right?
Yeah, they had locked up the courthouse. Everybody was gone. The lights were out, and then suddenly on the probate judge website, they posted a third set of results, and this time they just simply subtracted 6,200 of my votes, which gave the election to my Republican opponent.
And everything's locked up, so you can't go into the room and find out what this glitch is. There's no one who can answer any questions. Is that right? And
yeah, so this is I find this out at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, and the results were posted just within 4 minutes, I think, after the second set of results. So here we have the results that were posted on the courthouse door that showed that I was winning. And then less than 4 minutes later, after everybody has gone home, they somehow or another came up with a third set of results, which were 6,000 of my votes, 6,200 of my votes simply disappeared.
And it handed it to it handed the overall election to your opponent, right?
Yes. And the odd thing, of course, is that they took 6,000 votes, 6,200 votes for me, but it didn't change a single down ballot race by.
Right. What kind of glitch? What kind of glitch does that? There's no such glitch. Yeah.
So the person, the people who were given credit or took credit for the win in Baldwin County was first a guy named Dan Gans, who had been my opponent's, I think, chief of staff at one time. He worked for him in Washington and worked for him in his campaign. And he held himself out to be a ballot security expert who had been trained by the software vendor.
And who was the software vendor, by the way? It was
ES&S or something like that.
It was ES&S. You and I already talked about it. And I read also Bev Harris, who's an author and election integrity advocate, investigated your election to an extent, and it was ES&S, which is a vendor I write about quite a bit.
Yeah. So
actually, I want to stop right there for a second, though. How do you guys know, or maybe you don't know, but that was in the documentary, which, by the way, I recommend everybody to watch. It is just jaw-dropping. It's called Atticus versus the Architect, and it's free on Amazon Prime, and it's thrilling and distressing and incredibly educational. But in it, they said that Dan Gans and another guy, I think his last name is Berger, had received training from the software vendor, which they don't say it's ES&S in the movie, but it was. But whoever it was, what kind of voting software vendor gives training to one side in a political race? That's insane. I've never heard that before. And I'm wondering, did they just run around and tell people they got the training, or do you know how we know that?
I don't know. They may have, I have no idea, but he did make that claim at one point. So
that he'd received training, you mean, or that he was a ballot security? Or both?
No, it's my understanding that he made the claim that he had been trained by the software vendor.
That's just crazy. That is just highly suspect in and of itself. And he was also sitting outside. This was one precinct, right, that was involved with the 6,000 votes being subtracted from you, and he was seen sitting outside that precinct with a laptop on election night. So, like,
well, again, that was a report that was made. It was also in the documentary. I was, of course, not there. I was in Montgomery celebrating my win.
Oh God!
But I wanted to also mention the second person who received credit for stealing the election, or for the outcome of the votes that swung the election to my Republican opponent, was Karl Rove's assistant, a woman named Kitty McCullough, Kelly Kimbrough. She changed her name to Kelly Kimbrough and then got married again. But she was a deputy to Karl Rove in the Bush White House. And she was sitting with the party chairman that night, Republican Party chairman, as they were pondering what to do about Baldwin County. So, there was some involvement of her. I don't know what it was, but
she was celebrated as having been instrumental somehow to that. So, and Gans, I wish I had time to find the quote again. It's in your, I think it was definitely in the documentary. And I took a screenshot of it just when I was watching the documentary. There was like something that Dan Gans posted outside his door or on the website or something for the lobbying firm that he later went to, where, it was very specific that he definitely took credit for the vote outcome, the vote total outcome.
It was on
bizarre. Why would he? It wasn't that he took credit for a great campaign or anything. It was rather specific to the vote totaling.
Finding the votes that the 3,100 votes necessary.
Yeah. And then he took it down, right? When he got heat for that, eventually they took it down.
But what, I'm going to, pardon me while I've got a little throat issue.
Oh, no, that's all right. Some of those details are just so fascinating to me. And Jack Abramoff himself is also, I mean, he also was a lobbyist, by the way, just while you're taking your step. He was a lobbyist well, his firm was a lobbyist for Diebold Election Systems, which is was sort of a sister or brother company to ES&S before ES&S acquired it. But in any event, all right, so then you have Dan Gans and Kitty taking credit for your loss. Jill Simpson is someone who did she actually work on your opponent's campaign? She's a Republican. She was a Republican consultant, right? Or is?
I'm sorry, who?
Jill Simpson, Dana Jill Simpson.
Yeah, Dana Jill Simpson is a Republican lawyer, and she was close with she had worked for a number of years with my opponent's son, Bob Riley's son, who's also a lawyer. And her conscience bothered her. She testified before the House Judiciary Committee that she was on a telephone conversation after the election with the husband of my prosecutor, who said that he had spoken to Karl, and Karl had gotten the Justice Department to pursue me, and that they shouldn't worry about me making a comeback in 2006 because they were going to prosecute me.
Sickening. I mean, yeah. Good. She was like a whistleblower. And I'm sorry, I kind of cut short, I think, your story. So they actually, I made you jump the gun. I'm sorry. So actually what she was talking about is maybe I didn't really. So after this election, there was a call because you were planning to run again, despite the theft of your election, you were planning to run again, and they were thinking of ways to derail you during this call. And she didn't say anything at the time. It was later on, after they actually pursued the plan and succeeded. And so ultimately, ultimately they did successfully prosecute you. And
we have to back up a little bit.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So the night of the election, I won. The next morning, I called the probate judge and said, I want to recount a hand recount of the paper ballots in this one precinct where my votes disappeared.
Should be a no-brainer, easy.
So right? the judge said, Governor, I was expecting your call. We'll have everything ready. You can come down and we'll have a place for the media to sit, and we'll keep them separate. And it shouldn't take long with just one precinct. Before we could get to Baldwin County, the state attorney general, who was Karl Rove's client, seized the ballots and the cassettes that were produced in every precinct from the optical scanner, and took everything to Montgomery and certified my Republican opponent as the winner illegally, because the law requires that the certification only take place in the county on Friday following the election after 12 noon. So, this was we couldn't challenge the election because we didn't have the ballots. We couldn't get a recount because the attorney general had seized the ballots. And it was
no one to really go to because he's the attorney general. There's no one to complain to, really, right? I mean,
no, well, I could have complained to the Alabama Supreme Court, but Karl Rove had taken over the Supreme Court in Alabama. Rove has Alabama is where Karl Rove got his momentum to create his future political ambiance. So after winning several Supreme Court races and the Attorney General's race in Alabama, and Attorney General's race, because he helped get Jeff Sessions elected Attorney General. And
Jeff Sessions was his client too?
Well, no. I mean, he was in Alabama during the time that Jeff Sessions was elected.
Oh, he was just instrumental behind the scenes. Okay.
Yeah. And Jeff Sessions' name, you mentioned conviction. So after winning and then losing the election in Baldwin County and losing statewide, I said I was going to run again. It was at that time that, a few months later, that Jeff Sessions was approached by the Republican Party chairman to get him in line to run against me in 2006, because the incumbent Republican, Bob Riley, had proposed a tax increase, and the Republicans had shifted from Riley to Sessions, and they wanted Sessions to run against me.
Right.
It was then that Jeff Sessions, that retired FBI agent that had worked for Jeff Sessions when he was a U.S. attorney in Mobile, started building a case against me, which ultimately led to my conviction in 2006.
And the conviction, what they did is they took sort of bribery laws, but they stretched it in a way that it's never been stretched before. So there were sort of two parts to it. Well, number one, they stretched it in a way it's never been stretched before, right? So they made it so that even though you receive no personal benefit from this alleged bribery, that could still be bribery. That theory had never been pursued before. And then they got a witness who, their key witness, what they did is he already was facing a long sentence for a real crime, and they got him to perjure himself and testify against you by threatening him with a life sentence. And there were witnesses to this who said that this is what happened. Threatening him with a life sentence and threatening his daughter. Is that right?
Yeah, and the witness was a Department of Justice.
The quid pro quo part?
Yeah, the witness was a Department of Justice paralegal. The witness of getting the government's witness to lie against me. The Department of Justice paralegal filed a whistleblower complaint saying that she was present when the prosecutors and investigators pressured and cajoled and threatened their witness to testify against me, and got him to remember things that he clearly didn't remember.
And he said that there was like a check was brought to a meeting, and then the check, it turns out was dated, months later or weeks later. So yeah, they got him to fabricate a
even that witness later confessed to Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes that he had been asked to write and rewrite his proposed testimony over and over again until he got it the way the government wanted it.
Liked it. So he was heavily coached. It's interesting. And so ultimately you had to you served 7 years, right? They
sentenced me to 88 months. I served 5 years.
You served 5 years, and you were out in 2017, and they put it like a gag order on you also, right? Where you weren't allowed to talk to the media.
Well,
or they put you in solitary when you tried?
Yeah, I tried to talk to the media. I tried to talk to the Tom Hartman radio show out of Portland, and then I called the Washington Post and spoke with them. And in both cases, I was put in solitary confinement for a pretty long time.
They tortured you. And they tortured, yeah. It's disgusting. And this is, I think, unfortunately, highly relevant to the election that's coming up, because we have Trump, who will do anything to stay in power, now sort of partnering with Karl Rove, who is a monster and will do anything to win. I believe he was a never Trumper, by the way. This is just, let me do a quick segue. I don't think he would, or at least he wasn't a fan of Donald Trump, but
they called him a moron.
What's that? He called him a moron. But number one, Rove loves power above all else. And number two, Russia most likely has Karl Rove's emails, because he kept his emails. Ironically, a lot of people don't know this, but he kept his emails, and a lot of members of the Bush administration kept their emails on a private server at a company called SmartTech. And SmartTech was hacked by Russia in 2015. And whereas Russia released the emails that it got from the Democrats, it has never released the ones that it got from SmartTech.
Boy, I'd love to see those.
So would I. And so there's
Russians, if you're listening to this broadcast.
Yeah, Russia, if you're listening. Yeah.
To quote Donald Trump.
So he may be acting under duress, or, someone like him he's such a narcissist. Even if he has been threatened, he's probably convinced himself that he's acting of his own free will. But I would not doubt for 1 second that there's a bit of a threat hanging over his head about these emails. Because
Karl Rove has a history of shenanigans when it comes to elections, whether it was his own election to the college Republicans, where he went around the country with Lee Atwater creating bogus chapters of college Republicans, and then challenged. He threw the election into question by challenging his opponent's delegates when it was really his delegates who should be challenged. And then
All projection.
And he did the same thing in Alabama in 1994 when he created this aura that there was a election fraud around the state Supreme Court election, and ultimately got a lot of legitimate absentee ballots thrown out, which swung the election to a Republican.
And so he uses a combination of actual psychological warfare, and then in your case, as you said, actual election fraud through surrogates. He doesn't. I don't think he's in there doing the machines himself, but he will.
I want you to keep. I'm going to interrupt you because keep in mind, Alabama has had sort of a sordid history of voter suppression because of our African American population, the slaves, free slaves, and then they were terrorized and then prevented from registering through all kinds of tricks like the poll tax and literacy test, and then along comes Jeff Sessions as a U.S. attorney and attorney general who threatens Black political leaders that they're going to go to jail if he even suspects that there's any kind of absentee voting fraud. And he put two friends of mine, African American women, in prison for 2 years.
Oh, Jesus!
And so
can you tell me what their names are? Was it written up in the?
Maggie Bozeman and Julia Wilder. Julia Wilder was a retired 72-year-old school teacher, one of the sweetest, dearest ladies I've ever met. And, this guy put her in prison for 2 years. But
and actually, no, can I pause for a second though, right there? Because I like to pull the past to the present as much as I can. And in Tennessee, it's happening sort of right now because there's this big push now to expand vote by mail, and I don't ever mean to suggest that vote by mail, by the way, is a panacea, but in any event, with a pandemic, it certainly makes sense to give that to people as an option. And in Shelby County, Tennessee, the Republicans there are fighting it tooth and nail while, being perfectly happy with touchscreen voting machines that have been shown to delete votes from Black precincts. But they're happy with it. And not only are they don't want the absentee balloting expanded. And not only that, they actually, they started adding threats to the absentee ballot form, like in bright red ink, saying, basically, if you apply or vote absentee and you weren't actually qualified, it's a felony, and including such and such.
It's another form of voter suppression. I mean, this is their game. They want to suppress, particularly African American votes. Or Democratic precincts, heavily Democratic precincts, and this is part of their modus operandi. They've done it here, they've done it all, And in Alabama, if I can take you back to the formation of the Republican Party in Alabama.
Please do.
Well, in 1948, when Harry Truman was the Democratic nominee, they had a civil rights plank in the platform of the Democratic National Committee, and the Southern Democrats, who were white supremacists and avowed white supremacists, formed something called the Dixiecrat, meaning Dixie as in the South and crats as in Democrats. Democratic Party, they had a convention in Birmingham and nominated Strom Thurmond from South Carolina as their presidential candidate. Tell
us who Strom Thurmond is. Not everybody might know.
Well, he was, I think he was the longest running U.S. senator from South Carolina, and avowed segregationist, and he was followed.
And he's a Republican, right?
Yeah, he switched parties to become a Republican.
So he wasn't. Okay, got it. So the Dixiecrats kind of moved into the Republican Party, basically. Well, certainly for the national politics, and ultimately probably for the state politics.
But the remnants of the Dixiecrats were revived by George Wallace in 1968, and again in 1972. I was actively fighting Wallace while I was president of the student body in 1967. After I finished Georgetown and Oxford, I came back to Alabama, worked for the state Democratic Party chairman to battle Wallace again when he was trying to take over the state Democratic Party, take it away from the National Party, use it as a springboard to run for office. But it was after that that I got elected Secretary of State. And it was in that position that I started looking at how some voting precincts came in at the last minute, and so when I went out to these counties and talked to—
This was in the 90s. I'm sorry. What was this, in the 70s or the 90s?
This was in the 70s.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's 70s and early 80s. So
Okay.
when I talked to election officials about why certain precincts reported last, I was told that that's where, if you needed any extra votes, then that's where the Dixiecrats would get them. If they needed to beat a black opponent, they had a precinct that was lined up in advance where the sheriff, the probate judge, and circuit clerk would all agree who would work at that particular polling place. And after the polls were closed, they would vote in the names of those people who had died or moved out of state. And nobody would ever know because the votes, the ballots themselves were counted and then sealed inside of a box, and the total was posted on top of the ballot box. So they could get away with that kind of
Fraud.
Vote stealing back in those days.
And actually, can we pause there for a sec? Because that is hand-marked paper ballots, which is what I advocate. But a point that I've tried to make is that you can steal an election absolutely with hand-marked paper ballots if you count them behind closed doors or you don't maintain this chain of custody. And so we have two examples here. What you're describing happening in the 70s and 80s is behind closed doors, and then Karl Rove's goons snatching them.
What happened to me in 2002.
In 2002, and we need to watch out for this. We need to watch out for this in November. The chain of custody, even when we have hand-marked paper ballots, if you can't count them, and we didn't get to count them, by the way, in 2016 either. For whatever reason, the Democratic Party didn't even try. And then, Jill Stein, who has her, I'm not particularly a Jill Stein fan, but she did file a recount anyway, and that we did not really get a hand recount in most places. And Lord knows what happened to the chain of custody. So we need to the Democrats in November need to get serious about the chain of custody. We need not to just turn out in numbers. We need to have teams of people there, I think, to watch out for, demand the chain of custody records and see what happens to the ballots after the polls close. But go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there's only one reason why Donald Trump would ask Karl Rove to come to the White House, and that is because they're anticipating this huge surge in paper ballots, this huge surge in absentee ballots to come in 2020. Karl Rove knows how to do this. He will have people dressed up in suits and ties at every voting place, challenging voters if they don't have a sufficient voter ID, or maybe it's not the same as but it'll be. I can guarantee you there will be people of color who will be challenged. There won't be people from Republican precincts that will be challenged by these Rove security people that'll be at the polls.
And they're going to be there after too, though. They're going to be there for the counting also, right? I mean, they're going to be there.
They will be there particularly for the counting of absentee votes, where they will be challenging, the people voting in Democratic precincts who have any noticeable flaw on the outside of the envelope.
And they'll be challenging signatures too, right? So they'll be saying, they'll say these signatures don't look exactly the same. And the thing that's really scary about signature mismatch, I mean, I don't know that it scales up the same way as electronic ballot fraud, but the signature match requirement can absolutely be abused. You can tell what ethnicity people are often by their signature and also by their zip code. You can also get an idea of their political leaning. And so, yeah, we have to really be prepared to have people in the room. I keep thinking of from the musical Hamilton, you want to be in the room where it happens. We have to have people in the room where they are looking at these signatures and deciding whether they match and deciding whether there are other requirements for whatever obstacles they put on that voters have to put on the outside of their ballots. The voters are contacted before their ballots are tossed and given a chance to cure, because I think win or lose, they're going to either way. They're going to try to disadvantage the Democrats. I mean, I think that's obvious, actually, but they're definitely going to be doing this. And we need to be prepared. So it's not going to be enough to just vote this year. I don't think we need to sign up as monitors for the counting.
Well, one of the things that I find odd is that there has not been. I mean, I recognize we've been involved in a couple of major crises in the country. You know, the pandemic and the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. But I'm surprised that there hadn't been more attention being focused on the fact that Trump and Rove have formed this coalition. And I mentioned
it's because our country lives in denial. You're the only candidate who's had their election stolen from Rove, who's even willing to say this, other than John Kerry belatedly a few years ago, who's even willing to say they suspect election fraud. We've been living in this sort of myth that we have the best, not only the best democracy, but the best elections in the world. And no one wants to scare people away from voting, but I don't think talking about these things does. What it does is it motivates, in my opinion anyway, all the people I know who are concerned about theft are much more motivated not only to vote, but to do things like monitoring the polls for fraud and scrutinizing various aspects of the process to make sure, to the extent we can, that we have a reasonably free and fair election. So do you think it's helpful to propagate this myth that that all of our elections are necessarily legitimate?
Well, I think that it's just hard for people don't want to believe that our elections can be stolen or that elections can be hacked. They don't want to believe that the Russians can influence our who's elected president of the United States. But the truth of the matter is, we need to be highly alert. And the Democratic Party, we're fighting on two fronts. One, if Russians are going to be trying to influence the election to get Trump elected, that's one concern. The other concern is that Karl Rove is going to be trying to do whatever he can to get Trump elected. Exactly. And that's something we can do something about if the Democratic Party will get organized. And it doesn't even have to be Democrats. It can be, some of these people, young people who are now protesting, if they will volunteer to be poll watchers and to be, to take some role. We've got to, the Democratic Party has got to recruit a lot of people to help. And we're going to have an army of people on election day.
And one thing that people can do, so the closest that we've come to actually proving election fraud in recent elections has come not from party officials or candidates, but from sort of ordinary citizens / election integrity advocates who've reviewed poll tapes, which are the printouts that are generated at the precincts after the polls close. And it's generated by the voting machines, even the paperless ones. So even the ones where the voter doesn't get a paper ballot, after the polls close, they generate these tapes. And those should match what's then reported on the other end by the county central tabulator, which aggregates all those precinct totals. That central tabulator should provide a breakdown and then a totaling. And in fact, when election integrity advocates have looked, at least in two recent examples, they didn't match up. And one of the most high profile ones that I've been trying to bring more attention to is Shelby County, Tennessee. Benny Smith, an election commissioner in Shelby County, made that comparison in 2015 in the context of like the third lawsuit that had alleged election fraud there. Shelby County is home to Memphis, and it has a large African-American population, and yet somehow Republicans kept sweeping these county elections, and the Democrats kept filing lawsuits saying, we don't trust these electronic results, but the machines were paperless. So Benny compared the precinct totals to the reported totals in some of these African-American precincts, and they showed that a severe drop-off when they should match. Instead, those African-American votes were disappearing somewhere en route to or at the county tabulators. And this is ES&S equipment, or ES&S had the contract. It was Diebold equipment. Those were related companies, ES&S bought Diebold and had the contract. Same thing, similar thing in Georgia in 2018. A review of the poll tapes showed 127,000 votes that couldn't be accounted for, that had somehow disappeared from African-American precincts. And we got to wake up, because we need people to do things like reviewing poll tapes, and we need people to be in the room when the absentee ballots are counted. And no one's going to motivate to do that if they're told that election fraud is not really something we have to worry about. So there's an organization I want to mention called scrutineers.org that is organizing people and training people to do things like review poll tapes and monitor the polls. And that's something that I think it's worth people checking out to get ideas and to sign up. And it's certainly a good place to start. So.
Absolutely. I think, I think, young people who are looking for a place where they can make a contribution in 2020, volunteering to be trained and working at the polls as a poll watcher could be an enormous help.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, I do want to say that it is an enormous help. For whatever reason, what I find just really odd is most of the large voter protection groups that do recruit poll workers to do incredibly important work on voter suppression, which I do want to, I mean, you can make the argument that that is a type of fraud, but you could make the argument, but it's not traditional fraud. So it has to do with things like, voter ID, I guess, would be the biggest one at the polling place. So, and voter ID, by the way, I think a lot of Republicans, who don't look at these issues that closely, think, oh, well, most people have an ID, they should have to present an ID. Well, even if you want everyone to have some form of ID, and I don't actually have an objection to some form of ID, it's the exact match type of stuff that kills me. If there's a dash in your name, or it's the same thing with signature. It's really ripe for abuse. If you say that they have to match exactly, then one has your middle initial, the other one doesn't. It's clearly you, and if they don't want you to vote, they just turn you away, and you'll have all of these Karl Rove / Trump people at the polls ensuring that happens. It's just really dangerous. And the notion that student IDs in some place aren't good enough, but an NRA membership card, I believe, have you heard that is good enough as an ID? That kind of thing is just really unjust. So.
Well, and that's those are the kind of challenges that are going to be made by the Karl Rove forces in 2020, when an African American comes in with some
or
kind
Hispanic
of ID
voter
that doesn't suit their liking, they're going to challenge that person. And it's scary to some people to be challenged by authority and asked to stand aside while everybody else is allowed to vote.
Oh, yeah.
So it is discouraging, and it is a form of voter suppression.
Yeah, it's almost a form of terrorism. There were videos, over the past few years of, in particular, young people just, crying because they were called out at the polls when they would go up to vote, and, made to feel like the other and told that they weren't citizens, and when they were. And but what I wanted to say is, so the voter protection groups do a really good job. Well, at least I hope they do. I think they do. ACLU and I don't know where else, but I'm sure the Democratic Party they do recruit people for that. But I don't think they train, unfortunately, to look out for election fraud, which is why I'm going to give another plug for scrutineers.org, because I don't really know any other organization that is training people to look out for.
Yeah, I did not get any attention from the Democratic Party when my election was stolen.
Exactly.
None, zero.
And it's just 60 Minutes, right? Didn't 60 Minutes actually cut that part out from your story? So they did a big thing on the political prosecution, right? But they cut out the part about election.
Well, they didn't. Yeah, they didn't mention that. But yeah. So
I also had heard from Bev Harris. I know you know who she is. She's an election integrity advocate and author who discovered all kinds of really disturbing information about the seedy underbelly of our elections and published it in her book called Black Box Voting. And she told me that 60 Minutes knew. So Diebold Election Systems was about 30% of U.S. election equipment for a while, and its senior vice president and senior programmer was a convicted embezzler whose crimes, 23 counts of embezzlement involving computer tampering, sophisticated computer tampering. It was Beth Harris who discovered this. 60 Minutes knew about it. She told them. And I think, I gather other people told them, and they didn't air it. So they knew this. I mean, doesn't prove, no, that does not prove in and of itself, but it proves that we're not vetting who's in charge of these private companies that are in charge of our votes. That's what it proves. And it proves negligence, or really recklessness, I think, on the part of election officials and the US government for entrusting our most precious votes to these companies without vetting them, knowing who, or maybe they did know who they were. Maybe they did vet them. Maybe that was a plus. I don't know.
Well, what
I apologize for my cough. I don't think I have any. I don't think
you need some of my cough medicine.
I don't know. I think something just went down my throat.
I may have given that to you the last time we talked, but
over virtual cough.
What baffled me was after the 2002 election, there was a study done by an independent college professor, and he presented a paper to the American Political Science Association, laying out how my election was stolen, and still the National Democratic Party, or no member of Congress raised the question. Anyway, it was surprising and disappointing. And
in fact, Eric Holder, I'm sorry, go ahead. Wasn't it? It was John Conyers, was one of the only Democrats who actually took what happened to your election seriously. He's also, by the way, and he's passed away now, but he also was he was the head of the House Judiciary, right? And he was a Democrat. He also was one of the only ones who took what happened in Ohio 2004 seriously with voting machines, and was very concerned that there might have been election fraud there. And there were lots of, certainly, coughing screwed me up. Certainly there were a lot of indicators of potential election fraud in Ohio 2004, and the Democrats just wouldn't
pursue it.
Wouldn't pursue it, and they didn't pursue it with you either.
They
Do you have any thoughts as to why that is?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any insight or thoughts as to why that is? Has anyone told you why that is?
No, I know. It's I think that people don't want to raise issues like, why we are falsely led into a war, or why we engage in torture, or why we pass the Patriot Act, and why we're reluctant to take on some of the ugly parts of United States character, and part of that is election fraud, and but we have got to take it seriously going into 2020.
I agree, and it's not fun. I mean, telling people this really, but it's it's necessary. And every now and then, I actually don't get as much pushback as I think some people do on trying to warn people. I mean, for the most part, I don't claim to know for sure that specific elections have been stolen. I can't prove it in court, certainly. But God, there's a lot of indicators on some of these elections. And some people are just very worried that it's going to suppress turnout. If you tell people that, but what do you think about that?
I don't think it's going to suppress turnout.
This cough is really unfortunate. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. What I tell people is we've got to vote in stronger numbers, more numbers, and we've got to, cast more ballots than they can possibly think about stealing. And in large part, that is the truth. We've got to vote. We've got to vote so heavily that we cannot steal enough votes to win.
Yeah, but in addition to that, I don't think it's enough. I think we have to monitor also. I mean, hopefully that'll be enough. I think it's also going to be our job to monitor the counting to the extent we can, and maybe in some of these hot spots, in some of these swing states, maybe the largest counties, to actually try to do things to the extent we can. Not everybody posts poll tapes, unfortunately, even when they're supposed to. Not everyone is required to, but even in a state like Georgia, they actually do. And in Shelby County, Tennessee, that's how. So I think it's really important that we start taking responsibility as citizens for this. And part of that is just, getting over ourselves and our image as having had this perfect democracy. And it doesn't mean every election was tainted. It doesn't mean every election will be tainted, but we have to be realistic that they can be. And it's our job to safeguard our democracy for ourselves and for our kids and grandkids and really the world, because now we've got maybe the most dangerous president in world history. Well, yeah, he could do more damage, I think, because we're such a powerful country with nuclear weapons and everything, and financially, and it's really important, and we just can't continue to deceive ourselves and not take those protective steps. And I don't think we're going to get the critical mass necessary to protect our elections without being honest that
absolutely
the potential for theft is there. And again, it doesn't mean necessarily that it'll happen, but I certainly think there's going to be attempts.
Well, if we were really serious about, we would have some kind of a national commission that would require reporting from every Secretary of State on their preparations for the election and by precinct. So we would know how many people are expected to vote in each precinct, how many ballots and how many machines they have ready for each of those precincts well in advance of the election. So there's no, there's less chance for a Secretary of State to shortchange one particular precinct where they want to suppress votes. Shortchange in the sense of giving them
that's a really great idea.
Not enough voting machines or not enough ballots or not having enough people there, so that the lines build up long and people get tired of waiting and go home. So we need some. I think we need some kind of overall commission to look at well in advance all of the the preparations that are being made by secretaries of state to see if they are actually prepared.
Do you think that can be done for this election, or is it, because certainly it's not going to come from the federal government, which I don't think, I don't necessarily, I'm sure there's some good actors left in there, but I think there's a lot maybe who are compromised at this point.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be done for this election, but I think that would be one thing that would be helpful to help.
That sounds really helpful. Sure. What about with vote by mail? What do you think can be done to protect that? I mean, my biggest fear with vote by mail in terms of sort of this ability to scale up problems is that a lot of voters just won't get their ballots. And I think that can be unintentional or it can be intentional. So we had LA County is sort of when this first got onto my radar. Actually, really, frankly, Brexit was when it first got onto my radar, because a lot of voters there, they didn't receive their mail ballots, and they had a private company called IDOX with ties to the pro-Brexit faction, very close ties, a chairman who was a pro-Brexit MP at the company, handling their mail voting. And lots of voters apparently didn't get their mail ballots, but they don't really have, certainly much less so than the US, an election integrity community there, demanding or scouring for the type of details you'd need to see if there was some kind of, how anomalous it really was, or if it was anomalous. And so you had Brexit, and then 500,000 voters in a recent Australia election didn't get their mail ballots, which sounded like a lot. LA County, 17,000 voters didn't get their mail ballots, and this is pre-pandemic in their primary. I guess the pandemic had technically started, but there was no shutdown, and it wasn't really on our radar yet. So that was just one county, LA County. And then Maryland recently, a few weeks ago, I think it was a few weeks ago, 1 million voters didn't get their mail ballots on time. With the Democratic election official, Linda Lamone, who, at least she's Democrat in name. She's had lots of other problems. She was also a big proponent of paperless touchscreen voting machines. But I'm in Georgia, I don't think we have a number, but certainly a lot of people didn't receive their mail ballots, and they were forced into the polling places. And something I worry about with the Democrats is they seem to be very simplistic in their strategies, and they go all in on one thing or the other. And, it's just voter suppression, or it's just this, or it's just that. So now we just have to vote by mail, and vote by mail will solve everything. And it won't solve everything if if a lot of voters don't get their ballots. And that's even without taking into account a possible infiltration by Russia of the voter registration system, which could change people's addresses so that they don't get their mail ballots. It would also be a problem at the polls, but at the polls, at least you could vote provisionally in theory and have lawyers following up on this. So, yeah, we have to do an in-person polling, even with significantly expanded vote by mail. At least that's my opinion. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, I think vote by mail is, there's nothing wrong with voting by mail if people get their ballots on time and are able to send them in, and they're counted accurately. But there are a lot of ifs in there. So that's why I would again say that if we had a national commission to oversee the voting and to make sure that people got their absentee ballots and that they got them on time so that they could return them either in person or by mail on time. And then that there is a process for overseeing the counting and process and a scrutinized process for challenging, so that you don't have all of these ballots thrown out for technical reasons. So anyway, I think we need more of a national structure.
I think we do. If the Democrats take everything over after the election, maybe there will be some hope of doing that. But right now we have such rot in our government that I don't think we have good faith actors, enough Republican good faith actors to fill such a commission, unfortunately. I mean, and even the Democrats, if we're not acknowledging, people are attacked for saying our elections are vulnerable to domestic election fraud. If people are attacked for just acknowledging that basic fact of human nature, then we're not going to have a meaningful commission. There's just got to be, I think, public education, a mass public education before that. And I actually hope, I think you can be a real part of that. And I'm hoping that this will start. I hope I'm not the only person, or no, I know I'm not going to be the only person who interviews you, but I hope people will interview you not just about the horrific political prosecution, which also it's a whole subject in and of itself. And
in my book,
what's happening now with Reality Winner having been imprisoned for blowing the whistle on Russian interference, and we're in a lot of trouble. Anyway, thank you. Is there anything else that you felt that we didn't cover that you want to say before we sign off?
Oh, just I hope people will get my book, Stealing Our Democracy, and I hope they will read it, because it is not only about my election being hacked, and not by Russians, but by people with connections to Karl Rove. It's about how we ensure that people who are the most vulnerable, who happen to be people of color, how to protect them from the abuse of power by police, by prosecutors, or by presidents. So anyway, it's currently trending #1 on Amazon.com.
So, and here it is, Stealing Democracy. I got an advanced copy.
That's right. Thank you.
And my kids even got a signed copy. So you guys can't have that, but you can order it on Amazon Prime. No, it doesn't even have to be Prime. You can just order it on Amazon, right?
Or when is it? Just order it from your local bookstore.
Or your local bookstore. Has it been released yet?
It will be released June 16th. So next week is the key day. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. And I do also want to give another plug for Atticus versus the Architect. It will change, I think, the way a lot of people view the United States in a way that's maybe not great, but I think it's really important. If we're going to improve the situation, we have to know what we're dealing with. So thank you so much for talking to me, and let's talk again soon.
Thank you so much for what you do.